thank you once again for coming along. We want to look today, especially in the middle of a natural disaster here in the United States, at this whole question of, did we see it coming? Could we have prevented things, not hurricanes, but our response to them? Could it have been, in effect, more effective if we had known something, if we hadn't been lied to for years, and not just years, whole decades, in fact. So we're going to, in effect, explore this question in terms of what's been called climate damage assessment, assessing the full cost of 40 years of profits, lies, and deception from the fossil fuel industries. Not just petroleum, but coal and natural gas as well. It's those industries that have, in effect, lied over the last 40 years now, and the information about this is spilling out all over the place. We want to look at a full cost accounting, therefore, of hurricanes, floods, fires, and sea level rise. How should we begin to think about an accurate and adequate full cost accounting of the tragedies that we are now seeing unfold all over the place and around us? It just one day's headlines make it very clear. Take a look.
California Governor Jerry Brown declared a state of emergency in Los Angeles County Sunday morning as more than 1,000 firefighters battled the largest wildfire in Los Angeles history. The La Tuna fire erupted Friday, quickly grew to encompass more than 7,000 acres just north of Los Angeles, the second largest city in the United States. The fire shut down the 210 freeway and forced hundreds of people to evacuate. The Caribbean and southern coast of the United States are preparing for Hurricane Irma, a powerful Category 4 storm currently churning west across the Atlantic Ocean. Both Puerto Rico and Florida have declared state emergency. The storm is expected to make landfall on the island of Anguilla on Wednesday and then continue toward the U.S. coast. In more climate-related news, more than 100,000 people have been forced to evacuate their homes in Nigeria because of widespread flooding in the center of Nigeria. In South Asia, the historic flooding that's killed more than 1,200 people has also destroyed as many as 18,000 schools, leaving as many as 1.8 million children unable to go to class. President Trump has nominated Republican Oklahoma Congressman Jim Bridenstine to head NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Bridenstine has no science credentials and has repeatedly denied the human impact on climate change. NASA conducts a significant amount of global climate change research. In 2013, Bridenstine took to the House floor to demand President Obama apologize for funding climate change research.
Well, that's what we're up against. We're getting nominees who know nothing about climate. Trump nominates Bridenstine as NASA chief. This would be laughable anywhere else in the world and at any other time of history, but it's absolutely tragic at this point. We have to start asking some serious questions and get some answers. Harvey could break the record for financial damage by any storm in American history. Why should the taxpayer pay for this? Who should pay for these damages? The victims? The taxpayer? Or those who profited from making this level of damage inevitable? They didn't cause the storm, but the question is the level of damage. What about Irma that is just hitting Tampa Bay as we speak? What about the whole state of Florida? Well, there have been arguments already presented by Peter Frumhoff and Miles Allen in The Guardian this last week. Big oil must pay for climate change. Their article is really very sobering and needs to be looked at in detail. Allowing companies to make private profit while society at large underwrites the cost ends badly for everyone, they argue. And they point out that now we can calculate how much big oil should pay for this. Very interesting argument. It's based on a peer-reviewed scientific journal article that they wrote together, along with several other authors. And it's worth tracing down that article from Transition Studies and looking at it. Miles Allen, Peter Frumhoff, here from Cambridge. Peter is an active member of the Union of Concerned Scientists, USA, based in Harvard Square. Now we can calculate how much they should pay. Well, that's the question, the open question in a way, because there are things left out of damage calculations that ought to be taken into account. Let's take a look at what we did, for example, 2 years ago and look at this. We asked back in November of 2015, what if Big Oil and their consultants, people like Danny Yergin, hadn't deceived us for decades? Where could we be now in addressing the global energy and climate crisis? So 2 years ago we asked these questions, and it's crucial to start asking them in terms of opportunity costs. Where could we be if we hadn't been deceived, if the American public hadn't been lied to? We looked at it 2 years ago. Let's look again. This evening we want to look at a big question that's facing the entire world in a sense, but we want to look at it in particular in reference to the way the public, the entire global public, has been deceived in the last several decades, not just the last several weeks, not since the last election, not just the last several years, but decades, the last several decades. So we want to look particularly at ways in which big oil and fossil fuels in general, and all their consultants, have been deceiving us, and ask the question, what if big oil hadn't deceived us for decades? Where could we be now in addressing the global energy climate crisis? This is a global energy climate crisis. It's not specific to any one country, and we could be in a very different position if we hadn't been lied to for decades by the fossil fuel companies and their consultants. We've seen some of that very clearly in videos like the Crude Awakening, the oil crash. We're in fact in real trouble, as these documentaries have pointed out. And for a while, there's been some insight on this from individual scholars like M. King Hubbard, who warned against this coming scarcity of oil in 1949 and again to Congress in 1974. We really ought to take a look at a little of that history.
In 1949, oil geologist Dr. M. King Hubbard developed the theory of oil depletion, making the prediction that the fossil fuel era would be very short. In 1956, he forecasted that American oil production in the continental 48 states would reach peak production in 1970. Production did peak that year, as he predicted. In 1974, Hubbard testified to a Senate subcommittee warning of the dangers of declining fossil fuels in an exponential growth culture. The U.S. oil peak in 1970, combined with a crisis in the Middle East, led to severe oil shortages and an economic crisis in the country. Americans experienced record high interest rates, long gas lines, the highest gasoline prices in history, recession, and a declining stock market. Government films were produced explaining the problem.
We were caught by surprise with a crisis that could recur and recur unless the entire country recognized the dangers of a quite real energy shortage.
Okay, well you can see that there was a recognition back in effect, the mid-70s, that we were in crisis, and in fact that's exactly what some of the scholars pointed to and drew attention to in other areas, well beyond their academic circles, as it were, well into the 1970s and 1980s. But a lot of that was ignored, and ignored for a reason, as we'll see. Some scholars paid attention to it. People like Danny Yergin here at Harvard.
I'm sometimes asked if I'm optimistic or pessimistic about energy. And I suppose, to some degree, it depends on what terrible news I heard on the news in the morning when I wake up.
Daniel Yergin teaches at Harvard, and he's helped produce a book called Energy Future. There are some days when he doesn't think that future is very bright.
How dependent we are. Well, really, we do not have very much more time to get a handle on this problem. And I am pessimistic when I look at the last more than 6 years and see how little we have done as a country to respond sensibly in our own interest to this very great problem.
Okay, to respond sensibly and in our own interest to this very great problem of the limited future of fossil fuels. He's well aware of this in 1979 when he's interviewed here. But something very interesting takes place, in effect, and that is an election in 1980. And as you recall, the 1980 election had some major consequences. What happened? You can answer it pretty simple. Reaganomics.
Ronald Reagan moved into the White House and dramatically cut research and development for alternative energy. It was morning in America again, and the country went to sleep for a generation.
The country went to sleep for a generation. Now that's an interesting way to put it, because in effect, the problem didn't go away. In fact, the pre-coal problem became the subject of quite a bit of controversy and discussion within academia. Take a look.
But the problem didn't go away, as oil consumption continued to increase year after year. In 1997, petroleum geologist Dr. Colin Campbell wrote The Coming Oil Crisis. 3 years later, he founded the Association for the Study of Peak Oil, known as ASPO, and held the first meeting on peak oil in Sweden in 2002. Dr. Ken DeFay, a Princeton oil geologist, published Hubbard's Peak in 2001, followed 2 years later by Richard Heinberg's seminal work, The Party's Over. In 2005, Matt Simmons' book, Twilight in the Desert, challenged the stated oil reserves of Saudi Arabia. A flood of books and magazines began to appear on the market. 25 books were published in 2004 and 2005, and hundreds of articles in newspapers and magazines.
Well, hundreds of articles, a flood of books made it very clear. But despite this overwhelming evidence of peak oil and peak everything in fossil fuels, the limited nature of fossil fuels, others went on to make a different case altogether. In the meantime, one energy expert, as he became known, seems to have been totally seduced by Reaganomics. And 32 years after his 1979 insight, he published a book called The Quest, in which Danny Yergin then claims there's no such thing as peak oil. He's interviewed about it. Take a look.
In your book, you debunk the theory of peak oil and argue that the world is not running out of fossil fuels. Why not? What's your theory?
We're not running out of oil anytime soon. Ever since oil started as a commercial industry in western Pennsylvania in 1859, there have been recurrent fears and scares that we're running out of oil and this time it's over. But every time we see new technologies applied, new areas open up, and we've seen that today with the growth in U.S. Domestic oil production. The state of North Dakota now is the fourth largest oil producing state in the country. And there are substantial resources. There may be questions about access to them. Some of them may be higher cost, as we can see. But when you add them up, we see continuing growth in the availability of supply. And so that the notion that there's some imminent moment when we run out understanding that when you look at all the oil fields and all the reserves and so forth?
Well, very, very interesting. There's a continuing growth in the availability, according to Danny. Of course, his own graph shows that there isn't a growth in the availability from the U.S. That's flat. That's been flat since the 60s. Where there's continuing growth is outside the United States. And he seems to be quite optimistic about that with the technologies available. Well, at the same time that Danny left Harvard and set up a firm called the Cambridge Energy Research Associates in order to advise the big oil companies on how to sell their oil for the most profit, the oil companies themselves then invaded academia. Take a look. It's really quite staggering as a proposition. They, in effect, went to college. Big oil went to college, and it's been reported on by Jennifer Washburn quite effectively in a very sobering report on, in effect, analysis of 10 research collaboration contracts between leading energy companies and the U.S. Major U.S. universities. This is staggering because Daniel Yergin leaves academia to go consult on how to bring oil to the market, to the big oil firms themselves, and at the same time the university in effect is invaded or intruded upon by new corporate funding, and we get an expose by Jennifer Washburn on how corporate corruption of higher education has extended to this whole question of the research environment created by them at these various universities. Then, just this last month, another set of intriguing information starts to come out. Take a look.
Now, ExxonMobil, the oil giant, is recognized by the environmental community as one of the worst offenders on environmental issues. Environmental disasters from the 2013 Pegasus tar sands pipeline rupture to the 1989 Valdez oil spill have made the company a leading target of environmentalists, as has its funding for climate change deniers and its backing of organizations including the American Enterprise Institute and the American Legislative Exchange Council, known for opposing the Kyoto Protocol and other environmental regulations.
But a new investigative series by the Pulitzer Prize-winning news organization InsideClimateChange.org has uncovered that decades ago, Exxon was actually on the cutting edge of climate research. Here's a clip from the PBS series Frontline, which partnered with Inside Climate News on the project.
We found a trail of documents that go back to 1977. Exxon knew carbon dioxide was increasing in the atmosphere, that combustion of fossil fuels is driving it, and that this posed a threat to Exxon. At that time, Exxon understood very quickly that governments would probably take action to reduce fossil fuel consumption. They're smart people, great scientists, and they saw the writing on the wall.
One Exxon research project outfitted an oil tanker with equipment to measure CO2 levels in the atmosphere and the ocean.
We were collecting data of the Southern Atlantic, the Gulf of Mexico, and the Western Indian Ocean. Basically every hour we would get several measurements, so we had, I called it a data monster.
Today, Exxon says the study had nothing to do with CO2 emissions, but scientists involved remembered it differently.
We were committed, we were doing some serious science. It was a significant budget. I would say on the scale of $1 million a year. And that was a lot of money in 1979.
Okay, now that was a lot of money in 79 to, in effect, look at the problem of global warming, which they began to realize was human-induced and had to do with the burning of fossil fuels. And, in effect, as the New York Times reported on October 30th, just the day before yesterday, ExxonMobil is accused of misleading the public on climate change. Bernie Sanders has made the case. Well, Bernie Sanders made the case, and we have to ask ourselves in a sec, what would have been the difference if we hadn't been lied to for 40 years? I mean, it's absolutely staggering when you think of it. It was brought up by a presidential candidate, but now it's confirmed elsewhere.
First, a new tack in the battle over climate change, going after energy companies for alleged financial fraud. New York State Attorney General Eric Schneiderman recently subpoenaed oil giant ExxonMobil, apparently seeking documents that might show the company had downplayed the risks to profits and therefore to investors of stronger regulations on burning fossil fuels.
Right. He lied to his investors. He lied to the public. He lied to the regulators. Take a look.
In the fall of 2015, an investigation by the Pulitzer Prize-winning Inside Climate News, as well as the Los Angeles Times and the Columbia School of Journalism, revealed a trove of documents from scientists inside oil giant ExxonMobil, showing that Exxon scientists understood the mechanisms and consequences of human-caused climate change as early as the late 1970s and early 1980s.
New York State Attorney General Eric Schneiderman recently subpoenaed oil giant ExxonMobil, apparently seeking documents that might show the company had downplayed the risks to profits and therefore to investors of stronger regulations on burning fossil fuels.
Yeah, well, it's pretty extraordinary. The question was asked, prison for Exxon execs? Well, there's an effort to look at that whole question because of the same pattern of lying that took place in reference to nicotine in cigarettes. Should oil companies, or fossil fuel investors, in fact, be prosecuted with racketeering laws for lying to Congress and to the public, just as the tobacco executives were, in effect, prosecuted years ago? Well, Exxon responded by targeting the journalists. But the journalists have come back, and in fact academic studies have now been printed. This last month, in August, Harvard study came out indicating that Exxon did in fact mislead. They did an academic study, a detailed study of the content of Exxon's statements to the public as they were contrasted with the statements of Exxon scientists internally. And they concluded there were a two-track system where they knew internally the science was valid, but they were denying it to the public. Exxon misled the public about climate change, Harvard study shows. Again, in a peer-reviewed journal article, actually this is a letter to that journal, IOP Science, from the Naomi Oreskes here at Harvard. And it's pretty interesting.
ExxonMobil has long been criticized for allegedly hiding what it knew about climate change. Just today, a pair of researchers say that Exxon's own documents prove that is true. William Brangham has more. It's in our weekly series on the leading edge of science.
Thanks, Judy. Those two researchers who are from Harvard University, they published a study today alleging that ExxonMobil tried to systematically mislead the public about climate change for 40 years.
40 years, exactly. Okay, where would we be? And in fact, Exxon recruited other fossil fuel companies to join in that kind of thing. What if, let's ask the question, what if Big Oil and their consultants like Danny Yergin hadn't deceived us for decades? Not just since last year, the last election, since 1977. Further, there were other funders, as we've come to know, the developers of weapons of mass deception, WMD, against the American public and citizens of the world. They do this by funding programs like NOVA, which are thought to be brought to you by viewers like you, but in fact, they're underwritten by David H. Koch's Fund for Science. Well, what's coming next? We can expect some very interesting things in the wake of these hurricanes. Who will get bailed out? As it turns out, Mar-a-Lago has a flood insurance policy through the federal government, a very controversial one, which the president extended just days ago to cover his own Mar-a-Lago estates. As in the past, so too now, it appears that many losses of the billionaires will be compensated for by the taxpayers. Well, Naomi's referred to our last election as a corporate coup d'etat, and the president himself, monkeying around with the former CEO of ExxonMobil, has underscored that. But let's ask ourselves in climate damage assessment, how are we really going to hold these companies to account?
This is Noam Chomsky. You're watching Cambridge Community TV.